Think about the last time you saw a parent bouncing, swaying, or pacing with a crying baby instead of just standing still and holding them. That specific motion isn't a habit. It's a 2 million-year-old reflex, and ancient parents were relying on it long before anyone understood why it worked. Let's start with what that motion is actually doing, because the science behind it turns out to be far more precise and far stranger than most people realize. In 2013, neuroscientist Kumi Kuroda and her team published a study in the journal Current Biology that tested this directly. They monitored crying infants under several conditions, using continuous heart rate monitors and video analysis to track exactly what happened, second by second, under each one. Being held while a parent sat still, being held while a parent stood still, and being carried while a parent walked, only one single condition consistently worked. The moment a parent started walking, carrying the infant, crying dropped sharply within about 10 seconds on average. Heart rate slowed almost immediately, measurable on the monitors within the same brief window. The infants' bodies went noticeably still, muscles relaxing into the movement rather than fighting it. Standing still holding the same baby, no walking involved at all, produced almost none of this effect, regardless of how gently or how long the parent held them. It wasn't the contact alone, it wasn't the warmth. It was specifically the walking motion, carrying the baby's body through space at a particular rhythm, that flipped the switch. Here's the part that made Kuroda's study genuinely remarkable. She ran the exact same experiment on mouse pups, using a nearly identical setup, tracking heart rate and movement, while mother mice either sat still with pups or carried them across the enclosure. Baby mice, picked up and carried by their mothers, showed the identical pattern. Crying, or the mouse equivalent of it, dropped. Heart rate slowed. Their tiny bodies went still in almost precisely the same way human infants' bodies did, the same rapid onset, the same specific trigger of actual motion rather than mere contact. Two species, separated by tens of millions of years of evolution, running what appeared to be the exact same reflex. Kuroda named this the transport response, and the physiology behind it turns out to be remarkably specific. The motion of being carried activates a combination of signals from the vestibular system, the inner ear structure responsible for sensing motion and balance, alongside deep touch pressure receptors in the skin. Together, these signals appear to trigger a parasympathetic response, the body's built-in calming system, slowing the heart and quieting distress signals almost on contact. It's the same broad nervous system branch responsible for slowing your own heart rate after a stressful moment passes, just triggered here by a completely different, far more specific input. This isn't a learned behavior. Newborn mice have never been taught to go still when carried. Human infants only days old show the same response, long before they could possibly have learned what carrying means or associated it with safety through repeated experience, which raises an obvious question, one that took researchers decades to properly answer. If this reflex is this old, this automatic, and this widespread across mammals, what was it actually for in the first place? The leading explanation ties directly back to survival in the wild. For a mammal being carried by its mother, going still and quiet during transport isn't just calming. It's camouflage. A struggling, crying infant carried in the open draws attention from predators. A still, silent one doesn't. On an open savanna with no walls and no doors to close, a piercing cry wasn't just inconvenient. It was information, broadcast outward to anything nearby capable of using it. Kuroda's research proposed that this response likely evolved as a coordinated survival mechanism between mother and offspring. The infant's job was to stay quiet and still the instant it sensed movement, giving the mother the ability to relocate her young quickly and safely without broadcasting their location. For a species that spent most of its evolutionary history exposed on open savanna, with no cribs, no walls, and no safe room to retreat to, this reflex wasn't a nice-to-have parenting trick. It was survival infrastructure, built directly into the nervous system of every mammal that carries its young, refined across millions of years by a simple, brutal filter. Infants who stayed quiet during transport survived at higher rates than infants who didn't. And ancient human parents almost certainly relied on this constantly, not occasionally. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups still living in close approximation to how humans lived for most of history, have consistently documented something striking. Infants in these societies are carried for the overwhelming majority of their waking hours, often in slings or wraps pressed directly against a caregiver's body, moving whenever the caregiver moves, which in a foraging lifestyle means almost constantly, through gathering, walking, cooking, and socializing alike. Researchers comparing crying patterns across cultures have found that infants raised in these continuous motion environments cry significantly less overall and resolve crying episodes much faster than infants in cultures where carrying is occasional rather than near constant. Some of this research has specifically pointed to the near-total absence of prolonged, unresolved crying bouts in societies where infants spend most of the day in motion against a caregiver's body, compared to societies where infants more often wait in a stationary crib or seat between feedings. Ancient human parents weren't consciously deploying a scientifically validated calming technique. They simply lived a life where nearly every task, walking to gather food, moving camp, tending a fire, happened with an infant carried against the body in motion. The transport response wasn't something they discovered. It was something their entire daily rhythm accidentally, constantly activated, hour after hour, without anyone needing to understand why it worked at all. Here's where it gets stranger, though, because modern parenting eventually rediscovered this same mechanism from scratch centuries later, without initially realizing it was the same one. Cribs, strollers, and car seats are all relatively recent inventions, historically speaking, and each one, however useful, removes the constant motion that ancient infants experienced almost around the clock. Modern parents, often without meaning to, ended up recreating the exact conditions their ancestors' babies had by default, just as a deliberate technique instead of a side effect of daily survival. In the 2000s, pediatrician Harvey Karp popularized a soothing method known as the 5 S's, a set of techniques designed to calm crying infants: swaddling, side or stomach positioning, shushing, sucking, and swinging. Each S targeted a different piece of the same underlying puzzle, recreating specific conditions of life inside the womb and, unknowingly, life on the move with a carrying caregiver. That last one, swinging, rhythmic, walking-like motion, is functionally the exact same trigger Kuroda later confirmed in a lab. Karp arrived at the technique through years of clinical observation, watching thousands of parents and infants, and simply noting what actually worked. Decades before the underlying neuroscience explaining why it worked was formally published in a peer-reviewed journal. Two completely different paths: clinical trial and error in a modern pediatric office decades ago, and controlled laboratory measurement decades later using heart monitors and video analysis, arrived independently at the identical answer. So the next time you see a parent walking in slow, steady loops with a crying baby instead of standing still, understand what's actually happening. That's not improvisation. That's not just instinct in the vague, unscientific sense of the word. It's a specific, measurable, cross-species reflex, tested in mice, confirmed in humans, and running on nervous system wiring built long before either species had words for what they were doing. The baby isn't simply being distracted by movement, and the parent isn't just guessing based on what feels intuitively right in the moment. Somewhere deep in a nervous system built for a world with predators and open ground, the message is exactly the same one it's always been. We are moving, stay still, stay quiet, you are safe. That message has been running, unedited, across every generation of every carrying mammal that ever lived, including every single ancestor you have. It never needed updating. It never needed to be taught. It was simply waiting, fully installed, for the first time someone picked you up and started to walk.